real quick, the point of the session today is really talking about how to scale product-led growth. And so this can be at any kind of stage from like, we want to get started, we think we have a good product, all the way to we have, different go-to-market motions that are going after our product users, and we want to figure out like what we can do better. And so maybe for context, so for those who haven't had the amazing pleasure of meeting me, so I'm Francis. I'm the co-founder and CPO here at MadKudu. And again, for those who don't know, MadKudu, we're the leading PLG platform for B2B. And so what's been awesome in the journey of building MadKudu is that we've had the good fortune of running into a lot of really great PLG companies and working with them and seeing them grow through different stages of their maturity, and really being able to learn from that and see what are things that actually worked well, what are things that broke at different points in time, and from that essentially be able to establish a bit of a methodology and a product that supports that methodology. So a lot of these awesome logos out here are companies that a lot of you hopefully aspire to become at some point, or essentially even already are. But so the idea of this session is going to be taking from the learnings of a lot of these companies and seeing how we can take those learnings to apply them to your businesses. And so we're talking about like stages of scaling PLG, and maybe just to put it very, very simply, kind of when we think about it at MadKudu, there's kind of like four specific stages. And the first one is really, hey, we have a product, like we're a SaaS company. Right now, people reach out to us through demo forums. They might reach out to us through like downloading content, whatever it is, but we have a product. So we're trying to figure out like, how do we monetize this better? And that's really kind of the early stage where you don't necessarily have anything in place, but you're getting started. Kind of like typically the typical journey is then you go into, okay, like we have product users, so let's have sales go talk to product users. At some point you realize, well, that's great, but now when we're going hunting for bigger accounts and bigger deals, we'll realize it's going after users is not enough. And you should probably be going after accounts rather than users. So that's kind of the third stage there. And the kind of the last part is really embracing the complexity of B2B in a PLG motion, and starting to look at optimizing the different funnels that you have that support those revenue streams. And so the last piece of content before we start going into more of the conversation is maybe this one. This is pretty intense slide, but something that again comes from a lot of learnings of like working with all these companies is that I feel like there's a lot of talk out there around what PLG is, and it tends to be oversimplistic, right? We kind of like put things, like running PLG is like you have a P2L motion, or you have product users, and that's great, and then you have to figure out how to monetize them. But the truth of it is like there's not a single successful, even like medium-sized company out there that either only does PLG or only does inbound or only does, let's say, ABM, like outbound, right? So every company today has a mix of different funnels, and it's really, really important that you start thinking about it that way, and that you start kind of documenting where you're at with each of these funnels, right? So the typical way I see a lot of companies evolve is they'll start with like a very strong hand raiser motion, right? So that's kind of like the main source of revenue and pipeline for that company, where people say, hey, I want to talk to sales, and that's how they generate revenue. And then, like again, like the MQL motion, like everyone knows about this, like people download content, engage with the website, we push them to sales and then generate revenue. Then there's like a big chunk of PLG components where you might have self-serve revenue, just people swipe the credit card, that's awesome. Then you have users that the reps can help push over the finish line and get them to convert. And then there's the bottom-up approach, which I was saying is kind of like that stage 3 part in the PLG journey. We're starting to realize where there might be some companies where a single user is not able to go over the finish line. We need more engagement within the account. We need to get the buyer engaged with our solution. And that's where there's like this more account heavy, I guess, like perspective that needs to be added to your PLG motion. And finally, of course, like most companies, no matter if they are PLG or not, will likely run some kind of outbound/ABM motion. And so I think it's really, really critical that you kind of embrace the fact that as a scaling company, you will have a mix of all these funnels, and there's no way today to build a company that is only going to be doing one of these. Like generally, great companies are going to excel at one, find another one where they're starting to see success, excel in that one, find another one, and then over time they start building excellence in each of these funnels, because that's really the only way to meet your customers where they're at. Like not every customer wants to go through a self-serve experience. Not every customer wants to be sold by an enterprise rep. So it's really important that as you grow, your product and your buying process matches your customers. There's an awesome article that Jason Lemkin posted, I think, a couple of days ago, where he was saying, if your product is 10 times better than the competition, that's great, but your sales process should be better and 10 times better than your competition, right? So it's always about thinking like, how do we make it easy for people to use our product and actually buy it? And I think having a perspective around these funnels is critical for that, again, to make sure that people, when talk to sales, can raise their hand and talk to sales and not have to answer a bunch of questions around that. And people who want to use the product can use the product without having to talk to sales necessarily before. So definitely something I recommend that you take away for as kind of homework of like documenting like how each of these funnels work for you, and where you're seeing the bulk of the revenue come through today, and where you're seeing the biggest upside. And actually, let's move to the first more, I guess, like poll that I wanted to run with you guys. And I mean, the interesting thing is I recognize a bunch of folks in the attendees, so I'm happy to call out some of them. But I guess the question here is really, when you think about like people signing up for your product and trying to figure out how you segment them, like which funnel they should go through, aka like should someone from sales reach out to them, or should someone from support reach out to them? I'm really curious to hear. And so if you folks don't mind, would be awesome if in the chat you could add 1, 2, or 3, or actually 1, 2, 3 if you're doing each and every one of these. So the idea is that when someone signs up, you essentially run a segmentation by looking at what information they self-input. For example, you would ask like, how many seats do you expect to buy from our platform, or how many API calls do you expect to make? The second one is more third-party data. So for example, if you're a user of Clearbit or ZoomInfo or one of those, do you actually use that third-party data to figure out how you segment people? Or potentially, and this is something that other companies do also, is like you don't use any kind of demographic segmentation. You're rather kind of just using engagement data to figure that out. So would be super curious to hear from the folks here what is kind of your mix. And so it's really interesting to see that the self-input is a big one, which makes sense because it's pretty easy to put in the forms and to ask people to share their data. Pretty cool to see that quite a few of you are using the engagement information. And and then I mean in the chat, if you want to ask each other, it's like one of the typical questions that I get very often is like which tools are great for enrichment. And it's really interesting. I think like Clearbit is pretty like dominant on I would say the mid-market enrichment in the US, but then in Europe we're starting to see some new players come out, and it's pretty interesting also to see the DNA. If you're like ZoomInfo, more like caters more to sales teams versus I guess Clearbit that caters more to something like a growth team. But so the reason I'm bringing up this point is because in general, I see the vast majority of companies are going to be relying at least on number one, which is self-input data. And unfortunately, one of the things they don't necessarily realize is that self-input data is, I hate to say it, but most of the time is garbage. So just to share a couple stories around this, but when I was talking to the VP of growth of one of the products at Atlassian, and like he was a data nerd, and one of the experiments that they ran on this product is that they would have a drop down, that asked a couple questions, and one of the questions is essentially like what best defines your role in the organization, and they were kind of using that then to tailor the onboarding and say, oh, if you're saying you're a PM, we're going to show you these features, and if you're saying you're an engineer, we're going to show you these features. The very funny thing was that the no matter the values that were shown in the drop down, the first value was always the one that had the highest number of responses. So basically, people were just always clicking on the first value in the drop down, and it, regardless of what it was. So one week they would have that would be like product manager. So it seemed like that week, product management was the most common style of signups, and then the next week it was engineers. And so essentially what they found is that, yeah, they were customizing then and personalizing the onboarding based off of that. But the problem is that the input to their personalization was actually, yeah, pretty terrible and not reliable, and therefore they were probably delivering a suboptimal experience to their users. And so, like from that, it actually led us at MadKudu to run a quick experiment with one of our customers. So, like Pipedrive, for those who don't know, is a CRM for I guess like for SMBs mainly. And so when you sign up for Pipedrive, they would ask you, okay, what is the how many salespeople do you have in your organization? And they were using that to try and determine, if you said they had more than 20 salespeople, then you would go to their enterprise sales team, because they're thinking, okay, this is an account of high potential. And so what we found is that out of all the accounts that actually converted at 20 plus seats, only something like 5% of them would say that they had more than 50 reps. So essentially, like looking at that highest number of seats was not a good indicator. But when we were looking at third-party data, what we were finding was that like bigger companies within the right industries, like those kind of things, were actually terrific predictors of who was going to buy 20 plus seats. And so the story here is that you should work on reducing the reliance upon self-input information, because it is just very unreliable, and you might be delivering like a worse experience to your not only to your users, but also to the sales team if you're using that to push it on to push leads to reps. And Jennifer is asking, like, what happens if it's an open text field? We didn't really test anything on that front, but from what we see in like a lot of the open text fields that we get from at least our customers at MadKudu, again, the data is incredibly unreliable. So we have customers that will ask what is the company name, and they're trying to do this, say, oh, if someone signs up with a personal email, look at the company name that they input in the free text to try and figure out if this is like a big account or not. And it's 99% of the time either wrong information or not useful. And the few times where it is, you would have been able to get that through third-party data. And so we talked a little bit about like self-input, and just sharing that again, like try to reduce your dependency on that. And this is where like using third-party tools is incredibly helpful. The second data point that I wanted to bring, because we talked about using engagement as a way to promote people. So this is actually a slide that I stole from Thomas Tongus at Redpoint. So he shared an awesome, he had like 10 learnings from a big free trial survey that I think he ran maybe 2.5 years ago. And Ed, if you don't mind, if you can maybe find the link and share it in there, you've been like super helpful so far. So yeah, I highly recommend that you read that survey that they put together. But the learning on this slide, I think that's learning number 9 in his deck, was he was seeing when companies use activity-based scoring to promote users to the reps, what is the inherent conversion rate? And so what the graph is showing here is really interesting, right? So we're saying if the ACV is like between $0 and $5,000, the conversion rate essentially of using activity scores to promote to reps is pretty much the same. And then what's interesting is, like, if we look on the far right side, so when the deal size is between 50 and 150K, what the survey found was that actually using activity-based scoring, so like you think of it as like your typical like PQL kind of score, the leads that were, so the companies that use a PQL score to promote to reps actually have a much lower conversion rate. That's a 4%, 4% conversion rate versus a 15% conversion rate for the companies that don't use activity scoring. So that in itself, I think, is a pretty interesting data point, right? And the kind of the hypotheses and like why we believe that's the case is that when you're selling at these higher ACVs, the people that the reps should be trying to talk to and the people who are going to be decision makers and the people who are going to be able to help close the deal are very, very seldom users in the product. This is like one of the big things that I think a lot of companies get wrong as they're scaling is that you kind of expect that you're going to get more demo requests from the product users rather than actually realizing that you have product users that are going to use the product and potentially someone else from that company is going to come and request a demo. And if you just only hunt the people that are using your product, you're very often going to be hunting individual contributors, and that's not going to lead you to be able to close these bigger ACV deals. So that's where, again, like this idea of the best thing that you can use to kind of like run this initial segmentation of your signups is really like third-party enrichment to figure out like who's a good fit for your product. Like self-input information can maybe help you like gain a little bit more information on people that you're like either are kind of a medium fit and you want to use the information they added to like promote a few more. But then on the engagement side, if you're only using engagement, it's very, very dangerous because you're very often going to promote heavy users of the product that are not decision makers, especially at higher ACVs. And so that maybe leads me to the next question that I wanted to ask you folks is today when you're kind of like running your PLG motions, how do the reps get exposed to accounts or users in this case? So do you essentially have mechanisms to promote PQL, so leads and users that are very active in the product, or do you have something that looks at the number of active users in an account to essentially like promote the account? So same thing if we do 1 and 2 to say number 1 is you're promoting leads to sales and number 2 is you're promoting accounts to sales. Would be really, really curious to see again what the split is in the audience if you're running any of these. On our side, I'll add what we do, but we do 1 and 2. And as those come in, I think that there's also a bit of a frequently a misconception here that you would only do this kind of like bottom up approach if you have a very I guess like collaborative product or something like that. But it's really interesting to see even some of the more like dev oriented products. So think of like a MongoDB or tools like that, where actually that number of like users that are active in an account is a really, really strong indicator. Again, specifically when you're looking at some of the larger deals that you're trying to close. But so it's interesting to see that quite a few of you are transitioning to something that is account based. And so while people continue sharing on that, and that makes sense, Michelle, that like for that kind of ACV that you would want to be going for the second version. Just to share a story to illustrate the point a little bit, this is something that we ran into with our good friends at Envision. So Envision, for those who don't know, they're like a design product, a collaborative design product. And very interestingly, they have a freemium offering, and then they'll have their first price plan is at $19 per month, and it ranges all the way to like multi-100K deals. And so as they were trying to close more and more enterprise deals, because again, like they were at that stage of maturity where the lead level selling was working well. So they were identifying leads that were heavily using the product. They were, getting value from those, and they were able to close them. So now they're starting to think, okay, like how do we close more of these like 100K deals? And that was their enterprise motion. And so they tried to apply the same methodology of saying, well, let's take our strategic enterprise accounts and have them go after their named accounts that are showing product activity. And unfortunately, that was a complete flop. And the main reason for that, and the feedback that they got from the sales team, was like, look, we're talking to people that are definitely the right kind of accounts. We're talking to people that are super engaged in the product. They love the product. They're hardcore evangelists. But unfortunately, they don't understand why they should migrate to the enterprise plan. Like they don't really care, right? Like a single designer at Facebook doesn't care about like Facebook becoming an enterprise customer of Envision. And not only that, like they had no, there was not necessarily enough people in the account to even understand why it made sense, right? It could be like 2 designers at Facebook that are heavily using the product, but it doesn't mean that Facebook as a company is ready to become an enterprise customer. And that's one of the like really, really big shifts that needs to happen in the mindset of the demand gen team, to make sure that when you're handing over these strategic accounts and like potential enterprise accounts to the sales team, it cannot just be we have a few people or like 2-3 people that are active on the account. It has to be this account as an entity is showing enough engagement and activity that we believe it is now time to hand them over to sales. And that's definitely like one of the biggest areas where I see companies trip in, kind of like scaling their PLG motion. I'm glad Ed joined the stage, because I think this is one of his favorite slides. But the story I use here to maybe illustrate a bit this point is that one of the challenges that we have as professionals on the PLG space is that there's a lot of of PLG go-to-market motions that are inspired from the B2C side of things. But there's one very fundamental difference between B2C and B2B. And in B2B, we are selling to an account. We're selling to an entity that has multiple people with like competing objectives, with different, desires, hopes, and dreams. And so the story that I use to represent this is, the analogy rather, is that selling an enterprise deal is pretty much the same as the kind of overall plot of the Lord of the Rings, right? So ultimately, the Lord of the Rings is like a pretty straightforward story, right? It's like the story of the Fellowship of the Ring. There's a bunch of people that get together and say, yes, we need to destroy the ring, and let's, collaborate to make that happen. And the interesting thing is that along the way, there are different people that are going to play different roles in the deal. And sure, Frodo is the one who's going to destroy the ring, but he needed different people to help him along the way. Like he needs Sam to help him make it all the way up to the mountains of Mordor. And that's like the champion helping there. What's interesting is that Gandalf, who's kind of the instigator of this whole thing, is almost absent from like a huge chunk of the story, but then like comes in at a few critical moments in the deal cycle to help, right? So it's like Helm's Deep, like he comes to save the day, then at the very end to rescue Frodo, and that's kind of like your executive sponsor that is not like present all the time and doesn't seem like he's doing that much, but he might be, fighting in the background to actually help make this deal happen. And so anyway, the cool thing here is like the more you nerd out into the Lord of the Rings, like the more you can communicate with the team that yes, like this is not like enterprise deals are not straightforward. There's a lot of things that are happening. There are things that you might not see directly, but you need to make sure that you help those other characters play their part in the journey here. So I know we're getting close to running out of time, but one of the last parts I wanted to cover in this kind of like these aspects of scaling PLG, a big challenge that I see a lot of companies run into is their data stack, right? So many companies ask me, okay, like what, should we use Amplitude? Should we buy Pendo? Should we do this? Should we do that? Like, how do we get any of our product usage data in front of our reps? There's no way today that you could put your HubSpot or your Marketo tag inside your product. Like, first off, your product team is going to freak out, and secondly, your HubSpot bill is going to go through the roof, right? Because they're not designed to actually support that kind of volume of activity. And so it makes sales enablement really tricky because the reps don't understand and don't have visibility as to who's using the product, how they're using it, how they're getting value, all that stuff. So it makes it really, really hard for them to personalize their outreach. The similar thing kind of in the evolution, we typically kind of see like multiple evolutions. So it starts with like people not having data, and they start thinking like we need an analytics tool. One recommendation here, I would say I would not recommend using Pendo. I know Pendo is awesome to some extent as like a proof of concept because it's very easy to actually have a widget that surfaces product data inside Salesforce. But the big downside is that it doesn't play well with the rest of the data stack. It's really, really hard to extract product data from Pendo. And so while it might give you an initial gain of like being able to expose some data to your sales team, it's going to limit you in the future in terms of like what kind of data you can extract, what kind of analyses your data scientists can run in the background. And yeah, like that granularity of data is really critical. So one recommendation, and not affiliated with them in any way, but I think Amplitude is an awesome tool. It's like fairly cheap to get started, and it has like good APIs to export the data. So there's a lot that you can do, and your data isn't locked in with that vendor. But anyway, so like step one is really like making sure you have your data tracked somewhere and like landing somewhere that you own. The second one, and this is like a very standard thing that we see happening, is the data teams are going to start building some Looker, Tableau, whatever tool, like a BI dashboard that helps identify which users are active within the product. And then they tell the AEs, yo, AEs, like, all the data is here. Like there's a link in Salesforce. You open the Salesforce page, and now there's a link to a Looker dashboard for you to go check out the activity. Again, great proof of concept and a great way to, test and iterate on what data points are valuable and what data actually helps the sales team or not. But that adoption is going to not just taper off, it's actually going to decrease pretty dramatically over time because reps are creatures of habit, and they already don't want to go further than like Salesforce and outreach. So like giving them yet another tool to have to log into, remember the password, all that stuff is typically something that doesn't work. So then what we generally see is then companies evolve into a third stage where now they're starting to buy into like reverse ETL tools, and it's super exciting. The data team gets super excited because they can now like pipe data from their like Snowflake data warehouse into Salesforce, into HubSpot, and it feels like it's great. And to some extent, it is great. But again, it's an awesome proof of concept to show that you can actually build something quickly. You can push data into those tools, and you can build campaigns off of it. But it will remain in the hands of your data team. And that ultimately, I think, is a pretty big danger for a lot of companies. And that's where I think you need to get to then the next stage beyond that. And this is just an example of one of our customers' data stack representation before we started working with them. So it was just insanely complicated with like, there's like all the standard tools, right? It's like Snowflake, then DBT for the models, and it goes into like some reverse ETL to pipe data back into Marketo. But the challenge here was that it worked initially, but the real problem that they started running into was the fact that whenever they wanted to make any kind of like minor change to the data flow or to what data made it into Marketo, it had to go through a sprint review. It had to be prioritized against like competing initiatives. And so essentially the go-to-market team was just not able to iterate really quickly. And ultimately that leads the initiative to fail because like sales is like, as soon as they get exposed to data, they're going to have feedback. And that feedback might be really minor, but you need to be able to iterate quickly on it. Otherwise they lose trust and they lose the desire to actually play and interact with this. So really using these tools as a way to build like a proof of concept and like kind of like show to the rest of the organization that there's value in having data enablement to support the go-to-market motion of going after active users and active accounts is really critical. But you have to have a plan to move beyond these kind of like engineering tools that are stitched together. There needs to be a tool that is owned by the go-to-market team so that they can iterate on it quickly and they can do whatever they need to do to yield the most revenue. So I know this is probably like fairly intense and a lot of information. And Ed, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're at time. And so with that in mind, I guess just if you want to keep the conversation going, I'm always happy to talk more about your PLG initiatives and how to think about it, right? So please do feel free to reach out to me, and it won't be a self call. Don't worry. I do a lot of these with different companies out there to talk about what I see the company not doing right, where there's like areas of opportunity and things like that. I mean, PLG is still a very nascent kind of go-to-market motion, and unfortunately we don't have standards yet. Like, it's not well defined. Like, even the semantics are still something that's a work in progress. But on the bright side of that, we as professionals kind of like working on the PLG side get to define what the playbook will be for PLG. So please reach out. I'm always happy to help in any way I can. And otherwise, I highly recommend you check out the MadKudu Ops Confessions. We bring a lot of operators and they openly share some of the struggles that they face, some of the things that they managed to do well. So it's awesome to hear from like the operators at Asana, Lucidchart, Miro, and hear, like how they solved a lot of the problems that you're potentially facing, and just like get some inspiration from some of those companies out there so that you feel less alone in your journey to PLG success. But again, thanks everyone for joining. It was awesome seeing you here, and I look forward to continuing the conversation offline.